to Tennessee's At-Home Learning Series for Literacy. Today's lesson is for all the 6th graders out there, though everyone is welcome to tune in. This lesson is the 3rd in this week's series. My name is Megan Gilley, and I am a 6th grade teacher in Tennessee schools. I'm so excited to be your teacher today for this lesson. Welcome to my virtual classroom. If you didn't see our previous lessons or you'd like to revisit this lesson, you may go to Tennessee Department of Education's website at www.tn.gov/education. You can still tune in today if you haven't seen the others, but it might be more fun if you go back and watch our other lessons, since today we'll be talking about the things that we have previously learned. Today, we will be learning more about the historical fiction text titled The Wall, about the Berlin Wall. To get started and fully participate in our lesson today, you will need your paper, pen or pencil, a firm surface to write on, and your event charts from Lesson 7, both the event and character chart, as well as a piece of paper. So let's begin. In Lesson 7, we read Chapter 2 of the historical fiction book, The Wall. Things changed literally overnight for our main character, Franz Müller, didn't they? After our lesson, I asked that you write a paragraph of Chapter 2, including how the change in circumstances had changed some of the characters. Take a minute to reread what you wrote for your summary if you have it. I'm going to read you an example. And as I read, I want you to listen to verb tense. Verb tense is referring to time, meaning past, present, or future. And verbs, again, are actions of things that you do. So run versus ran, or talk versus talked, think versus thought. You get the idea. So follow along with me and pay attention to verb tense. In the morning, Franz finds his mother crying inconsolably in the kitchen with his grandparents during Chapter 2. Franz learns from his grandfather that a wall was constructed overnight to separate East Berlin from West Berlin, and that Franz's father is trapped in West Berlin. Later that day, Franz and his friend Roland walk to the wall, and Franz notices the barbed wire and the armed guards. His friend Carl, who usually likes to tell jokes, is at the wall wearing his uniform, looking very serious and carrying a rifle. Franz asks Carl to try to get a message to his father in West Berlin. Even though he is still worried about his father, Franz feels better because he has faith that Carl will get the message over the wall. So I want you to think about the verbs. In my summary, though, did you hear events from the beginning, middle, and end of the chapter? The chapter ended sometime in late afternoon, and there were events listed from across the day. The summary also told us that Franz, his mother, and Carl were acting differently than they had in Chapter 1. So let's think about the verb tense here. What were some of the verbs that you wrote down? I have finds, learns, walk, is, asks, and feels. When we think about literature, we use present tense. Why do you think we do that? I know it may be a little confusing, especially in this story, because there are dates that indicate that events have happened in the past. But the wonderful thing about literature is that it is new and it is present every time someone opens a book and reads it. So when we write about literature, we want to use present tense. Go back to your summary and I want you to check over your verbs and see, did you use present tense? If not, you might want to go back and tweak some of them. We'll go ahead and move on. I want you to remember that we are reading a story that is considered historical fiction. Remember, historical fiction is a made-up story, but about the setting being true and events that could have actually happened and did happen. What is the historical setting of our book, The Wall? Do you remember? That's right. It is set in East Berlin at the time the Berlin Wall was erected or put up, August 1961. Here is a picture again of the Berlin Wall. And here's the map showing how East and West Berlin was divided in 1961. What happened in Chapter 2 that lines up with this historical setting? What happens in Chapter 2 that lines up with this? Yes, in 1961, the Berlin Wall went up overnight between August 12th and the 13th. Could you imagine that? A wall being built in just one night? And that's what happened in our story. So as we continue to read, we know this event will impact our characters in our story. Before we start reading, I want us to take a look at the table of contents again. Remember that the chapters are arranged by date. What do you notice about the date for Chapter 3? Yes, it is August 17th, 1961, which is 4 days past the wall being put up. So today our goal is to think about how a chapter or scene moves things forward in a story. In other words, how a text is structured. We will begin with me showing you what that looks like, and then there will be time for you to practice with some support. And finally, I will assign you independent practice where you can work and complete after the video ends. Have your paper and pencil ready to take notes and answer some questions as we read. Before we get back to our story, I thought we could learn a little bit more about the Berlin Wall and how it was built. So I'm going to read from an article that was published in 1962. That's just a year after the wall went up, so keep that in mind. The first part of the article describes the wall, but since we've seen some pictures, I'm not going to read that part today. I'm jumping in where the author talks about what made the East German government decide to build a wall. The article is titled Die Mauer, published 1962. No matter how unattractive it is, the wall has largely realized its main immediate objective, stopping the residents of East Berlin from escaping to West Berlin. From 1945 until August 13, 1961, when the wall went up, nearly 4 million citizens of East Germany, roughly 1 out of every 4, fled to the West. This was not only particularly politically embarrassing, but economically difficult. Among those who left were 150,000 farmers and farm workers, 4,700 doctors and dentists, 800 judges, lawyers, notaries, and state attorneys, more than 17,000 teachers, and an almost equal number of engineers and technicians. About half of all the refugees were under the age of 25, 30,000 were students. Think of all those people leaving that country over about 16 years. Let me say that number again. That total is 4 million. In 1956, the government passed a law making leaving the Republic a crime punishable by 3 years imprisonment, but the flow of people could not be stopped. Some walked across the border, others took a taxi. All of them ran the risk of being stopped at customs checks by the East German border guards. From time to time, the Vopos, the police, arrested those who had given themselves away by nervous behavior or suspicious luggage, or had been turned in by their neighbors. However, the great majority of people from East Germany made it out successfully. It was open to almost anyone who was ready to leave behind his job, his home, and his personal possessions. The number of East Germans willing to do that in order to get out of the country averaged about 19,000 a month from 1950 through the first half of 1961. In July of that year, 30,415 people crossed over. By the beginning of August, the East German border police had reinforced to 6 times their former strength. Nevertheless, 10,419 refugees, a record number, got through. On August 11th, The West Berlin newspaper said quite specifically that the East German authorities had met that morning and had probably reached a decision to close the border. On that day and the next, thousands of refugees made their way to West Berlin, bringing the total for the first 12 days of August to more than 45,000. Shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning, a Sunday, East German armed forces began sealing off the border, meaning closing it. The undertaking was handled as if it were a military operation of high risk. Under cover of darkness, some 40,000 heavily armed soldiers and police, supported by tanks, armored cars, personal carriers, trucks equipped with water cannon, and other military vehicles, took up positions along that border. By dawn, the troops had strung up thousands of feet of barbed wire. Did you hear that? Sounded the same as what has happened in our story. I connected the construction sounds that Franz has heard at the end of chapter 1 to the text description of how the wall went up overnight. Did you hear anything here that didn't sound the same as what we've read so far? The author of this particular article said that on August 11th, the newspaper said that the border would be closing, but it didn't sound like Franz and his family knew that. Maybe we'll hear other connections as we read chapter 3 from our text. Let's begin. August 17th, 1961, East Berlin, early morning. Raindrops tapped gently against the crystal of Franz's watch face. It was just a few minutes after 7 o'clock in the morning when he stepped out into the light rain to walk to school. I'm going to pause for a moment because I noticed it says it was just a few minutes after 7 when he stepped out to walk to school. The author does something unique here where it talks about time, especially on Franz's watch. So as we continue to go through the text, I want you to pay attention to the time. The chapters give us dates. Franz's watch tells us the exact time of day. So anything that you want to note down about time, jot on a piece of paper or a sticky note. I'm going to continue reading. Though it was difficult to get out of bed that morning, Franz had made sure to rise good and early, even before his mother's usual wake-up call. He wasn't going to risk leaving too late and not running into Carl. What if he'd spoken to his father? People passing Franz on the street looked suspiciously at him as he walked around, looking left and right, forward and backward, over and over again, waiting to spot the familiar deep green uniform of the combat groups of the working class. After a disappointing 20 minutes, Franz ended up having to run to school despite his early wake-up. This was the 4th day in a row he hadn't seen Carl during his morning walk to school. And as a reader, I'm thinking about, okay, wow, for the first time, it seems like Franz woke up early to get to school. And I'm thinking, well, that's probably associated with him wanting to get word of if Carl has spoken to his father. So we're going to continue reading to find out what happens because he's disappointed and heads on to school. The school day seemed to drag on for an eternity. Franz's mind was filled to the brim with what ifs. What if his father wasn't able to cross the wall? What would happen to him if he tried? Would Franz's note get him in trouble? That's a really descriptive phrase there where it says filled to the brim. What image might that bring up to you? I'm thinking like, oh, a cup is filled to the brim. My coffee cup was this morning. It is filled to the max. So when he's filled to the brim of what ifs, he's overflowing with questions. Franz stirred from his daze when his classmate, Agatha Richter, asked hesitantly, so then why did they build the wall here? Confused, Franz looked over at the next boy next to him whose textbook, unlike Franz's, was open to the correct page. The class must have been discussing the Great Wall of China. When the teacher hesitated to answer, Agatha added, was it to keep people out like the Great Wall of China or to keep people in it? It was obvious to everyone in the room that the teacher did not want to answer any of these questions. He nervously wiped the sweat from his forehead and managed to fumble out, Die Tier. Mein Schulkind, which means the wall, my children, is in our best interest. The government believes that it will help us with the economy and things like that. He tugged on the collar of his shirt and, ignoring the apparent dissatisfaction of the class with his response, returned to his lesson about ancient China. So, do you find it interesting all of the things that they could be studying about that day in school, and they happen to be talking about the Great Wall of China? Well, this is historical fiction, so we know that the author has made up this story, and that's a choice that he has made. But why do you think he might have included this whole scene in the classroom? I'm thinking that maybe he wanted to create the opportunity for students and young children to ask questions about another wall. And so I wondered if he wanted to show how another adult in Franz's life was dealing with the wall. It was clear that the teacher was really uncomfortable. You can see when Agatha asked the questions, why did they build a wall here? The teacher hesitated to answer. He nervously wiped the sweat. He tugged on the collar of his shirt, which means that he was uncomfortable talking about it. So, as I read this next section, I want you to jot down what you hear that describes how Franz is feeling. Franz could feel his face grow hot. In our best interest, my dad is stuck on the other side of the wall. He wanted to get up, scream in his teacher's face, and stand up for his father and all the other people whose families were divided by the wall, but he knew better. His mother wouldn't approve of disobedience in school, regardless of the reasoning behind it. When the school bell rang, Franz hurried out before everyone else. He said goodbye to Roland in passing, telling him he had to hurry home to give his mother a hand with chores. In reality, Franz just wanted to be alone with his thoughts. Once the school building was out of sight, he slowed down and began shuffling morosely down the street, kicking pebbles and stomping in puddles. How does Franz feel here? I want you to think about it. His face grew hot. He wanted to scream in his teacher's face. He wanted to be alone. He was kicking pebbles and stomping in puddles. It seems to me as if he's frustrated and angry based on those descriptions. So if you took notes, I want you to jot that down as description. Shuffling morosely. This word here is in a sad or gloomy way. He's not shuffling with excitement. So that's something to pay attention to also about how he's acting. Let's continue on. Oof! Franz exclaimed as he hit his head and fell backward into a puddle. He had been so hunched over and focused on his feet that he must have walked into something. He had walked into someone. Carl! Boy, am I glad to see you. Franz leaped to his feet with renewed energy, paying no attention to his soaked clothes. Oof, Franz, said Carl. He rubbed his chest, which Franz must have hit with his forehead. Es tut mir leid, meaning I am sorry, Franz apologized. He was so relieved to finally see Carl that he couldn't get the words out fast enough. Have you heard from my father? He asked. The soldier shook his head apologetically. Nein, not yet, Franz. I haven't been able to get the message across the wall. He could see the disappointment wash over Franz's face, and he took a second to think. But there is a truck bringing some cargo across the border tonight. I'll try to send the message with one of my friends. That lifted Franz's spirits a bit. He thanked Carl excitedly and apologized again for walking into him. They parted ways there, Carl needing to return to his patrol and Franz needing to get home for dinner. When Franz sat down to eat with his mother and grandparents, He didn't bother them telling him about his meeting with Carl. The last thing Franz wanted to do was get his mother's hopes up. She had been quiet and withdrawn for days. Franz never thought he would miss his mother's nagging him to do his homework. So I want you to think about, is Franz's mother acting like she did in chapter 1, or is she acting like she did in chapter 2? I want you to think about that. I think she's acting more like she did in chapter 2, not chapter 1, because she's still sad and worried about Franz's father. We don't see her changing much right now, except that she's not crying inconsolably, right? Let's continue. With the help of Franz's grandparents, the after-dinner chores were done quickly, so Franz was able to get an early start on his homework. It was a good thing, too, because after today's incident, his teacher had assigned a significant amount. As the clock ticked on and the time neared 10 p.m., Franz found his eyelids growing heavier and heavier. Instead of answering his homework questions with long, detailed paragraphs, he began scrawling short sentences and phrases. The last thing Franz remembered before his eyes locked shut for the night was this doodle of menacing, meaning dangerous or threatening, barbed wire wrapping around his sentences. The word menacing here means dangerous, and you can see a picture here of the Berlin Wall. That looks menacing to me because you can see that it's super sharp. And there's glass sticking up from the wall, so definitely menacing here. Let's go back to our notes about time and description. Okay, readers. Today I asked you to think about 2 different things that strong authors do, and that's where they develop time and develop the setting in that way. So I want you to ask yourselves, why do you think the author wants to emphasize dates and time? We talked about that earlier, that we noticed on Franz's watch, the author's developing time. The chapters are written by dates. I think that the author wants us to pay attention to the dates and time because he is creating this sense of how quickly everything in Franz's life is changing, all in just a few short days. In addition, something that a strong author does is they provide description of characters, and that helps us to understand what the characters are going through and how we can connect and relate to them. So I want you to think about both Franz, we had a description of, as well as his teacher that we stopped to think about. Franz here was frustrated and overwhelmed, and we knew by the text description's face felt hot. He wanted to scream in the teacher's face. He wanted to be alone. He shuffled morosely, kicked pebbles, and stomped in puddles. So the author is using specific details about what the character's thinking or doing to show what the character is feeling. So below I have this sentence for you. It says the author showed how blank felt by describing. And I want you to either think this through or write it out on your piece of paper. The author showed how maybe mom felt by describing what, or the author showed how the teacher felt by describing what, or the author showed, you can choose Franz and use my notes to help you, felt by describing what. Again, thinking about, what are their actions? What are they thinking? What are they saying? How do they look? I want you to try to fill in that blank. This is a great way to reflect on how characters are helping to develop this story forward through how they feel. Today we have learned many words that have helped us grow as a reader. Again, we have more adverbs such as morosely, which means in a sad or frustrated way. What if the situation was differently? Why else might a person shuffle? I want you to think about that. Yeah, maybe if he or she is nervous or not in a hurry. So morosely helps understand what the author wants to communicate. He is shuffling because he is sad and frustrated. Words can help a lot with meaning. Lastly, we move on today to your independent activity. I want you to follow along. We've talked a lot today about the structure that the author is using and that the time has been an important element. Chapter 4 takes place on August 18th, 1961. That's the next day after the events in Chapter 3. So what do you think is going to happen in Chapter 4? Your independent assignment for today is to write the first couple of paragraphs, you can write more if you want to, of Chapter 4. Your prediction, of course, because I'm pretty sure you haven't read this story before. To write in a way that is like the author, start with the time and day that the chapter begins. I've also noticed that the author usually uses some dialogue, either inner thoughts of Franz or actual conversation between characters. So decide who is Franz talking to at the beginning of chapter 4 and include that in your writing. You may find a place to include something from the informational text we read about the Berlin Wall to make sure you are keeping the historical fiction. When finished with your writing, go back and check for correct punctuation and capitalization. If you have dialogue, you'll want to use quotation marks. So to recap your assignment, write the first few paragraphs of chapter 4 in the same style as the author has done in chapters 1 through 3. Include the time the chapter begins, have dialogue between 2 or more characters, and check for correct punctuation and capitalization. Be creative. I have enjoyed reading another chapter with you today. I am excited about sharing the rest of this book with you, and I think you are in for a surprise in chapter 4. Thank you for inviting me into your home, and I'll look forward to seeing you in our next lesson in Tennessee's at-home learning series for literacy. Bye!